We had a workshop a few years ago at the University of Alberta to how do we take into account the importance of Indigenous perspectives and, traditional ecological values. And that was just a fascinating workshop. And I always carry away with me one of the last speakers who basically was talking about how good reclamation can be. Like, we've learned a lot. And so the soil can be rebuilt, the plant community can be reestablished, but we don't necessarily have that sense of place. The spirit of the land isn't brought back. So we were even talking at that point in time, the importance of perhaps a repatriation, like a ceremony before the land reclamation certificate is actually issued, that would take into account that spiritual aspect as well. And what that just really resonated with me. But one of the important things that I saw were so many people. So we have people from industry, we have people from government, etc., that were at this workshop, and they got it. They all got it.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Kristoff, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Today's episode was just like all the episodes. I loved it, but this one even more so. My guest today is Dr. Naeth, and she was just perfect. She really understood what you're trying to do on a podcast. You know what I mean? How to get the important information out, the interesting information out to get people engaged and have it be enjoyable and informative and easy to listen to and charismatic. And she nailed it. She was perfect. I couldn't ask for a better guest. You guys are going to love listening to her, and you're going to learn a bunch. She is a professor at the University of Alberta in land reclamation and restoration ecology. She's also an associate dean for research and graduate studies in the Faculty of AILS at the U of A. And she's the director for energy systems, future energy systems, and the director for Land Reclamation International Graduate School. So she is very deeply involved in reclamation and restoration. She actually, a little teaser, she actually was the first one to get that degree at the University of Alberta. She actually made it herself. So she formulated that and kind of created the whole means of being able to research this and study it at the U of A. So it was really, really cool. She's really a forward thinker and really understands her craft and is very comprehensive about it. She understands the kind of the philosophical nature of it all the way down to the nitty-gritty details of the specific science behind it. And it just made for a wonderful conversation. You guys are going to love it. I enjoyed it so much, and I can't wait to have her on again. So yeah, just talking about, how do we define success in reclamation? And even more basic than that, how do we define reclamation and restoration? The importance of words in talking about this kind of stuff and what they mean. How do you rebuild soils? Like, how does that work? I don't get it. What do we do about abandoned wells or orphaned wells in Alberta, which is a huge deal, right? How did that happen? What was the process, and how do we start to deal with that and fix that? What are some of the solutions? Just lots of cool, interesting, fun ideas, and Anne nailed it the whole way. I really appreciated her coming on. So thanks a lot, Anne. And sponsors for this episode. West Fraser is the number one for 2021. I cannot thank them enough for their support. It allows me to do this the way I want to do it, and I just really appreciate it. So thank you, West Fraser. Greenlink Forestry is a secondary sponsor, been with me since the beginning. They provide me a space and the opportunity to do this, and again, can't thank them enough. Thank you, Greenlink. Damaged Timber is the final sponsor. They are a company out of Edmonton, Alberta, and they are making really cool stuff that you can put in your kitchen from local forests, right? So they go out into wildfire burn areas, cut down wildfire burnt trees, and then turn it into something that you can put in your kitchen. It's super cool. Check them out, damagedtimber.com. put in your Forest 10 at checkout to get 10% off. And with that, let's dive right into this awesome conversation with Anne. Again, you guys are going to love it. Without any further messing around, here we go. So while we start off, I usually start off just getting to know people's backgrounds. So for you, land reclamation, how did you get down this path, right? What was the motivation and the driver for going this way? And then after that, why is it worth it to you? Like, why do you keep doing this? What makes it, a useful purpose or useful make of your time, you know what I mean, of your life hours?
Right. Oh, I think I've been on this path for my whole life, really. Even as a kid, I was just so interested in nature, and we lived on a little mixed farm, which was just a short walk from the North Saskatchewan River.
Okay.
And so and between our home and the river, there was this little pasture. And one of my favorite things was just taking that walk and seeing when the crocuses were out in the spring and the buttercups were coming up. So everything was a little seasonal walk to see what was happening. So I just loved it. That's where I felt at peace, and that's where I felt more of who I was. And so when I went to university, interestingly enough, I didn't start studying environmental science or land reclamation. Land reclamation wasn't even a thing when I was starting university. So I took the traditional route, and I went into pre-med because I really love science, and I took botany as a free elective.
Oh, nice.
Loved it. Absolutely loved it. And decided, why am I in pre-med? I need to be in something that's a little more me, like something I really want to be doing. So I switched over my majors and started focusing on environmental science and botany and ecology. And that's kind of how it started. And then I wanted to do graduate work. And I was looking for something where I could combine soil and plants and ecology. And land reclamation was just a new thing at that time, like new in the sense of developing academic programs. So I was looking around for a land reclamation program for a master's, and there were none. So I was like, okay, well, I think I'm just going to have to make my own degree. So I talked to professors at U of A, at U of S, and a few other places. And the University of Texas and the University of Alberta were the most responsive. So I thought, okay, Alberta, yeah, I'll stay in Canada, and I'll do my master's here. So then I had to work with my supervisors. So I got co-supervisors, one in plant science and one in soil science, and said, I want to do reclamation. I don't know anything about it, but can we do reclamation? So long story short, they required that I meet the requirements of both programs, the plant science and the soil science program. So I ended up doing like 20 sub-courses just in my master's. But I did manage to get the reclamation project, and I got a special designation on my parchment, which was the first land reclamation degree at the University of Alberta.
Huh. That's awesome.
Yeah,
that's very cool.
It was pretty exciting.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, and you asked what keeps me in it. It's a passion. It's also a duty. Like I just saw when I was younger, so much of the land that I really loved being changed by industry and poor agricultural practices, and I just developed this great need to fix it, to do something about that. And it was pretty exciting to be able to make that a career. Whoa. And the interesting thing is, even today, after decades of being in that land reclamation career, I still get up every morning and I'm still really excited about what I'm doing.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, and you arguably started it in Alberta, so that's a pretty incredible story that you were able to carve out this space for yourself, and then now you're you know what I mean, you're leading it at the university, right?
Yeah, it's been really exciting to watch the program develop. Well, not just watch it, but to be actively involved in developing it. So we started out with this undergraduate degree in our environmental and conservation sciences degree program. So land reclamation is a major in that program. So we developed that 4-year program, and of course we've got a very broad graduate program. And whether it's in forest reclamation or grassland reclamation or remediation of contaminants, it's a very broad and well-respected program right now. So it's been interesting to watch the program evolve and see the students' interest in it. And it's never really stopping, because we're always modifying the program to meet the needs of industry and the world at large. And exciting things come along the way, like we started up the Land Reclamation International Graduate School in 2012 with an NSERC Create grant from the government. And so that's given us an opportunity to really expand into more of the international aspects of land reclamation as well. So I continue to see the program to evolve and grow and do what needs to be done to meet the demands of the times.
Mm-hmm. No, that's awesome. It's really cool to see somebody like kind of be a pioneer in that sense of recognizing this issue of a lacking of reclamation and remediation, and to be able to notice that and to have the wherewithal to think that you're like, hey, I could start this wave is pretty insane. Like, you must have had a lot of confidence to be able to just be like, yeah, I'm going to do this. It's awesome. I can't even imagine having that thought in my mind.
I'm not sure if it was being confident or being naive, or maybe a little bit of both, but it was just something I wanted so badly. And it wasn't just for me personally, but it was seeing the need and seeing this down the road as being something that would be not only necessary, but highly viable and exciting for students as well.
Absolutely. Well, it's the classic, in my mind, it's the classic, I want to save the world thing, right? Like in my mind, like it was something I was saying about, like a problem that this was just my own diagnosis of the issue, but, at the U of A, the forestry program for a while had a problem with enrollment, right? And I always just equated to the fact that it was called forestry, and forestry was seen as you know what I mean? As degradation, not as, being right. And that's kind of how I always thought it is. Like, people didn't understand the sustainability aspect of it. It was just kind of seen as not sustainable and not saving the planet, not being part of that solution. Whereas land reclamation and conservation biology was like, yeah, that's exactly what I want. You know what I mean? So I think it was that pull and just a misunderstanding. And so I think that the land rec, which is good, the land rec actually got a lot of a pull that way, and it was muchly needed, because I mean, look at how much anthropogenic disturbance we have in Alberta. It's insane, right? And it's much needed for sure.
Yeah, so land reclamation really is a way, when you're younger and you're saying, I really want to make a difference, I really want to change the world. Mm-hmm. And land reclamation in that context is something that's so tangible. Mm-hmm. You're not just advancing a theory, you're not just talking about something, but you're actually out there doing something and getting your hands in the soil and really reaping rewards very quickly, because of course you're looking at growing seasons, so you can see changes so quickly. So I think in that tangible way, it really appeals to people as well.
Absolutely. No, you're right. I think that's exactly what it is. You're right. Cause it's very real, and you can point to what you've done and like, look, I did this. And it's absolutely, I think there's a huge desire in our society for people to be able to point out what they've done and be proud of it. Right. Rather than, and that makes sense. That totally makes sense. Yeah. I love it. I think everybody in the environmental fields has that desire, but I think you're right in that land reclamation has the most tangible results. That's cool. So let's get into, I want to talk about the different like reclamation, just like defining reclamation, land reclamation, and the differentiation between remediation, reclamation, and the other forms of stuff that goes on in the landscape? Because I know there's a bunch of different ways of doing it. It's not just growing plants back, right, and growing trees back. You're talking about soil and everything else. So, could we just define, what is your definition of reclamation?
Absolutely. So I'm really interested in the terms. And before I get into the terms, I'll tell you, I have been working with a group of people around the world for about 12, 13 years now, where we're trying to standardize the terms that we use in land reclamation, because there's just so many terms depending on jurisdiction. But I have to say, after over a decade, I don't even think we're any closer to accomplishing our goal. But so let's talk about those definitions, because I do think they're really important. Mm-hmm. So land reclamation, put very simply, is taking land that has been disturbed and reclaiming it, getting it back to what it was either before the disturbance or to some other productive use. And so that means we could, for example, have a forested area that a coal mine is operating on that area for decades or years, and then it becomes agricultural land. Mm-hmm. Or it becomes a natural area. So going back to the natural area would be more similar to the land use that was there before the disturbance. Whereas the agricultural and land use would be different. So land reclamation is associated from a regulatory perspective with equivalent capability, which just means the land needs to be able to do what it did before, or else you won't get a reclamation certificate. It won't be reclaimed.
Gotcha.
So restoration is taking that disturbed area and putting back what was there prior to the disturbance. So if it was a forest, it's going to be a forest. If it was a natural area, it'll be a natural area. And restoration, usually we put ecological in front of it. So ecological restoration is really building that broader ecosystem rather than focusing on a particular end land use.
Okay.
And so I look at reclamation as the umbrella term, and restoration is a very specific type of reclamation. And then remediation is dealing with contaminants. And so those could be hydrocarbons, they could be metals, whatever happens to be usually in the soil, but also in the water. Mm-hmm. So soil and water contaminants that are above what's deemed to be safe and appropriate for a particular jurisdiction, mm-hmm. or else something that can't be there because of the end use that's being planned. So remediation would then be a component of the land reclamation process. And the same with revegetation. Revegetation is a component of the land reclamation process, and that's basically reestablishing the appropriate vegetation on that site. Now, there's a lot of terms that are used interchangeably, and restoration and reclamation in Canada are sometimes used interchangeably. In Alberta, reclamation is more the standard term, and restoration tends to be used maybe a little bit more by people in forestry, for example. Mm-hmm. And then the terms around the world, we have everything from rehabilitation to recultivation is a common term used in Europe, particularly in Germany. So when we're talking about it, those of us in the field, and we all know whatever R word you're using, we're talking about the same thing. Right. But I've always used reclamation, and I am very much, I always focus on words, and I love the roots of words and how we developed words. And so when I say reclamation, it comes from the word reclaim, which means we take it back. We've done something to it. It's not usable the way it is, but we're taking it back. We are reclaiming it. And when I think about restore, it's want to make it what it was before. So I guess that's why I really focus on those particular words, because it's always so much more meaningful when the root of those words makes sense.
I love that. I really love that. I think I've only begun in my adult life very recently to appreciate the power of words. Like there's that old adage, the pen is mightier than the sword, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think I always thought of it as kind of baloney up until like probably post graduating from university and after spending some time involved in some research projects and that kind of thing. And I started to recognize, you know what's actually funny? I think I realized watching the last Harry Potter movie, when Dumbledore says something about in his not so humble opinion or something like that. And I remember watching it as an adult and thinking about how well thought out Dumbledore's words were and how
Yes.
every word meant something very specific, where everyone else's is just kind of a jumbled mess of whatever. And I was like, oh, it's funny that was the starting point. But yeah, I started to appreciate the specificity of words and the language and what that means and how powerful that can be in commanding an idea, right? I love that. That's really cool.
Exactly. And once that hits you, it stays with you. And I was a very voracious reader when I was a kid, and I was just fascinated with words, and that kind of continued even into my undergrad. So I'm one course short of a minor in English. So, I know environment, English, right?
Yeah.
But it was just my fascination with words and the importance of words. And then when I worked with the Environmental Appeals Board for 13 years. I sat on that board. And when I started working with environmental lawyers, and, in the legal sense, a word means something very specific.
Yes.
And so then I really started thinking about the importance of what we were saying we were going to do when we were reclaiming or restoring. So as I've gone through my career, the importance of words, I think, have just been magnified in the legal context, in thinking about it even from an educational perspective, and trying to explain these terms to students, for example.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I just had a realization of where it really came to light for me was a gentleman by the name of Glenn Buckmaster was kind of mentoring me through writing this report, the scientific report for this project that we were doing. And it was kind of a new project. And I kept sending him the report, and he kept sending it back with like the smallest little, like, don't use that word, use this word. And to me, I was like, what the hell is the difference? They're the same thing. But then afterwards, through that process of probably, 20 or 30 drafts, I was getting really annoyed, but by the end of it, I recognized the importance of it and I really appreciated it. So no, I'm totally with you there. That's cool. Really, really cool. I love it. So I guess getting back into the reclamation away from the English side of things.
Yeah, right.
That's why we're here. So yeah, I appreciate those definitions, because I think for me, a lot of my questions were based around exactly that. Like I remember a time in my undergrad, we went up to Fort Mac and we were in one of the open pit mines, and they had showed us one of the new reclaimed sites where they had taken all the dirt that they had pulled up, put it in a big hill on the side, and turned it in and put the organic back and made it into a pine hill with a lake. And in my mind, I remember thinking, okay, this was like a vast peatland, like black spruce, larch kind of peatland, and now we've completely converted it to like an upland pine with some lakes. And I'm like, how is this reclamation? But I started to recognize the difference here is that you're saying the restoration is getting it back to what it was. Reclamation is getting it back to something that can be usable.
Yeah.
Usable. Yeah. Okay. So that starts to make sense. And I think that's where some of my curiosity came from, was just, yeah, how could we call this reclaim when you completely changed it from a peatland to like a, you know what I mean? Like a dry pine site in a lake. I'm like, that's just crazy. But I guess it has different uses, but it can also be used. But anyways, and also the point about the turning like a mine into agriculture land. Like that's a good point, right? It has use to us, and it can have ecological function as well a little bit, but in a different way. It's not restoration, but it is reclamation. So that makes sense. I really like that. That's cool to think about it in that more dynamic way.
Yes, and think about it from the context of what is it that we need as stewards of the land in that particular area at that particular time. Because we have to keep in mind that some of the disturbances take place over decades as well. And so when a mine, for example, may have been started, it could have been relatively pristine land in that area, and it wasn't a highly agricultural area. Whereas over the decades of the mining taking place, by the time the mining is done, that area has now become an agricultural area, and there's a lot bigger population, different needs for that population as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I recently had a discussion with a gentleman, Jake Keel, about sustainability, and it was a totally different context, but he provided an excellent definition of sustainability, and I'm kind of paraphrasing by memory here, but it was something about balancing like the needs of human beings with the ecological needs of the lands, kind of thing, right? Like we need to have both. We can't be favoring one over the other, right? And so I think as I was younger, I had a bit of that romantic view, as I think we all did, of the big bad companies, I'm going to save the world kind of thing. And then as you get older, you're like, oh no, like my entire life revolves around fossil fuels, and we need this, and it's been very useful, it's been very helpful, and we need these things. And then it just comes to, okay, how do we solve this more complicated question of having both human prosperity and environmental natural prosperity? And that's where this whole conversation comes about, right? It's really interesting to start to break that down into how do we get back ecological function after something like, you know what I mean, like open pit mines or whatever, something deemed environmentally destructive, right? And it's the process of getting that back to something useful is fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. And even the decision-making process associated with it as well. So are we going to reclaim to this particular end land use? Are we looking at a longer-term restoration approach? And I really like the definition of sustainability that you brought forward, because that's something that I embody in the work that I do in land reclamation and what I teach in land reclamation, that it's not just about our romantic views or our ideals, but it's about what is appropriate, and appropriate, of course, is a loaded word as well, but what is appropriate for the time, for the place, for the people in that particular area. And I think as I've started broadening my approach to land reclamation, it's become even more meaningful because it's not just an ideal that I'm striving for.
Yeah. So how do you make that decision? How do you make the decision about what? Because, like you said, if it can't be restored, if it's beyond that point, how do you make the decision about what to reclaim it to?
I think, well, there's so many facets to that, but I think probably the most important one is, first of all, addressing what was there before the disturbance. How long will this disturbance be going on? So I'm talking about now if you're planning, and land reclamation practitioners should be involved in the planning before the disturbance, not just coming in and cleaning up the mess after.
Sure.
So if you are involved in that planning, then you can say, this is forestry land. This is natural areas. I would be thinking much differently about how I would stockpile the soil, how I would deal with the removal of vegetation, than if, for example, the long-term use for this land is agricultural production. In that case, the soil is still critical, but the seed bank and the vegetation that are going to be removed during the disturbance take on a less important role. So the decision really has to be based on what does this land need to be after it's reclaimed.
based off the fact that we have like public forests, right? Like largely,
Mm-hmm.
let's just go with the argument that we're talking about reclaiming forest to forests, right? Some kind
Yep.
of forest, doesn't have to be the same forest, but some kind of forest. And it's a public forest, right? So who has the authority to make that final decision about like what it turns into? You know what I mean? Like
Oh,
how? Yeah.
yeah, that is such a fascinating question, and it's so jurisdictional based.
Mm.
And even just in Canada, for example, those decisions would be made differently in different provinces.
Mm.
So, for example, if there's a landowner and that's involved, then the landowner has some say in what that land should be. If it's crown land, for example, then usually it's specifically going back to what was there before. So when developers put forward their plan or their fill in the paperwork to get the opportunity to do the disturbance that they plan to do, whatever that is, then they are expected in most jurisdictions to have a reclamation plan. And so it's carefully outlined in that approval that they get, that this is what the expectation is, that you will have this land reclaimed to this particular scenario by the end of the disturbance. And so there's a lot of legal responsibility in that sense to, you can't just say, yeah, it's too hard to get it back to a forest. So I think we're just going to make agricultural land or something along those lines. So it's very much tied to what was there, what's going to be needed after the disturbance, and what the people who had a say, the stakeholders or the owners in that regard, really want to be happening.
That raises, I was going to ask this later in the conversation, but I think it's super makes sense to ask now, is when we talk about like First Nations values and First Nations, land rights and that kind of thing, how does that, I can't imagine that that's a simple process when it comes to land reclamation and mining and oil and gas or whatever it is, right? So how are First Nations needs accounted for in this process? Like let's say that this has been done, this is going to be done, like it's being planned to be done, and the reclamation specialists are there from the beginning.
Yes.
Yeah, how's consultation done, and how are their rights protected?
And there's the ideal expectation, and then there's what sometimes happens outside of that ideal world. I mean, ideally what we would be doing, and you mentioned the word consultation, which is very important. So as the decision is being made, what this land will be reclaimed to, what the expected results are to be able to get a reclamation certificate, then stakeholders' values and particular Indigenous people's values would be taken into account. So I see a lot of that happening. I see a lot of it not happening. Some of the really good examples that I have seen is where the consultation takes into account what plants are needed. And this might be for medicinal purposes, it might be for spiritual purposes, etc. But what brings value to that land and what has to be thereafter? And so I've worked with many companies, coal mining companies or oil sands companies, where the expectation of having these particular plant species becomes a very big part of the research. So we don't really know how to reestablish these particular species, but let's do some research to try to get this figured out before we're in the actual process of reclamation. So the consultation is critical. We had a workshop a few years ago at the University of Alberta to how do we take into account the importance of Indigenous perspectives and, traditional ecological values. And that was just a fascinating workshop. And I always carry away with me one of the last speakers who basically was talking about how good reclamation can be. Like, we've learned a lot. And so the soil can be rebuilt, the plant community can be reestablished, but we don't necessarily have that sense of place. The spirit of the land isn't brought back. So we were even talking at that point in time, the importance of perhaps a repatriation, like a ceremony before the land reclamation certificate is actually issued, that would take into account that spiritual aspect as well. And
Oh.
what that just really resonated with me. But
Mhm.
one of the important things that I saw were so many people. So we have people from industry, we have people from government, et cetera, that were at this workshop, and they got it. They all got it. They maybe didn't exactly know how we're going to go about doing this, but they got the message that this was important, and it wasn't something that we could tweak by adding another species or a little
Mhm.
bit more carbon in the soil.
It's not a
That they're,
checkbox.
yep, exactly.
Mhm. That's awesome. And I think that's becoming more prevalent, but I think it's been very rare. And there's a lot of frustrations, as you know, I'm sure, in First
Mm-hmm.
Nations communities about the neglect and the complacency when it comes to, making their values and their traditions respected, right? And so it's
Yes.
good to see that things are changing, and there's more respect there, and more recognition of the fact that, like, these nations have a huge stake in this, not just economically, like, the Western society always discusses economically and recreationally, but from their perspective, it's like you said, right? It's cultural, it's spiritual, it's an
Yes.
entirely deeper dimension than Western society discusses, and that's a really cool point that you brought up about that repatriation ceremony or whatever. And I think it's something that it'd be easy to pass by because it's very unscientific, and it's, you know what I mean? But it's very,
Mm-hmm.
I think we can all look past the science for a half a second and just think as a person with feelings and emotions and connection, that how important for a culture that is as connected to the land as First Nations are in Canada, to have something like that. Because like you said, you're completely changing the forest, and they must have, I'm sure there's some sort of cultural thing. Like I've had a lot of discussions about cultural burning. I did a podcast with Amy Cardinal Christensen from Anarcan about good fire, right? And we did a whole series talking to people from Australia and that kind of thing. And it took nearly the whole series for me to recognize that this isn't just prescribed burning. This is a
Right.
cultural
Right.
burning, right? This is a spiritual, religious, very in, you know what I mean? It's in their soul. It's not just a science thing. This isn't just a fuel reduction thing or a berry production thing. It's a soul thing, right? And I think bringing that in to all our decisions in environmental management is becoming more and more important and crucial because it's been lacking. And
Yes.
it's another thing. I'm just going on a rant here, but I had another discussion with Laura Calandrell on a podcast about the importance of bringing emotion back into our decision making, and like the science is crucial. We need the science that provides the facts and the truths and the literal on the ground thing we can point to, right, as evidence. But the emotions help us contextualize those facts a little better and make more comprehensive decisions. And so I think it's really cool to see everybody starting to get on board with that.
Yeah, and I totally agree, and you've expressed that so well. It's been one of the interesting evolutionary aspects of land reclamation, in the sense that when we first started doing it was very prescribed, it was very science based, and as it has evolved, we've seen that the feeling, the spirit becomes much more prevalent than we ever would have imagined. But it's almost like we needed to be able to grasp that science foundation to know what we can do in rebuilding soil and rebuilding plant communities, for example, before we could take that next step and say, okay, so how do we finish it? It's kind of like a painting. You get the basic. I'm not a painter, so I could have this all wrong. But you kind of get this basic picture of what you want,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's the finessing. So, it needs a little touch of shadow here. It needs a little bit more light here, and that's kind of kind of how I see where we've come with land reclamation, that we're recognizing it's not just what we can do technically, but the importance of taking all of those other cultural and more spiritual feelings into context when we're doing the work.
Mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely right. I don't think we were capable of that before because everything else was so new. We're just figuring it out, and the scientific process, although it's been around a long time, it was just becoming a cultural reality in the last few decades, right? So, yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
And just like many things in land reclamation as well, some of them become almost circular. When I first started out as a graduate student working in land reclamation, anything that we would now call natural recovery was just kind of viewed as the company reneging on its responsibility to reclaim. You had to get in there, you had to do what you had to do, and it had to be very detailed and specific. Whereas we have learned so much just by working with nature and understanding ecological process that now there's augmented natural recovery. And in some cases, what would be considered doing nothing is the best approach to be taking for that particular restoration. And, for example, and it usually does evolve around restoration, because we often can't get all of the species that we need commercially to develop that ecosystem. And so we rely on the surrounding natural landscape for those plant propagules, the seeds, etc. And now there's a whole, not regulated, but specific point by point approach, and the boxes you have to check. How big is the disturbed area? How close is the area that could be contributing to the natural recovery? Whereas, like I said, at the beginning of my career, it was no, you can't even think about that.
Yeah. It's an interesting point. Like, I've been reading some stuff about like reclaiming seismic lines and pipelines for caribou restoration, right? And we're doing a lot of that in Alberta right now, are trying to, right? And a lot of the discussion was there's so much. I can't remember. You probably know how many million kilometers of seismic lines we have in Alberta.
Oh yes, lots.
It's millions, right? Like
Yep.
Yeah, it's insane. Like it's unfathomable. And the point was, I only recently came to the understanding of that there's functionally restored and ecologically restored, like we were discussing. And a lot of these lines, although they may not have their previous forest cover, it may not be going back to black spruce or something. It may just be river alder or whatever. The shrub in and of itself acts as a function for restoration, right? And
Yeah. And we're also thinking as well now, what are the stages of reclamation? And so, for example, we may have a plan, we may have a trajectory that we're expecting, where we are going to be very reclamation focused and very low diversity plant focused at the very beginning, until we deal with some issues in the soil. For example, some very recalcitrant contaminant, or a major soil building process. And so we're looking at, okay, we'll do this. We'll deal with the contamination first. We will address the soil reclamation aspect next. And while we're doing that, we may be growing agricultural crops, cover crops, etc. And then when we've got that foundation right, then we can say, now we can focus on the plant community development. So it's not always go in a reclamation project and everything's done in a few months or, a short time period, and then we just let it evolve and develop. There's a lot more management and manipulation along those trajectories, and tweaking them as we need to make sure that the recovery is going in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and in particular with those lines, those linear lines,
Mm-hmm.
just the act of physically going down that line to a certain portion to try and reclaim it, you're going to have to destroy a certain amount of
Yeah.
vegetation just to get there. So it's
Ju-
interesting the double-edged sword of trying to do that stuff.
Yeah, indeed. And we have to always remember that land reclamation in itself is a disturbance.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
you're
So
right. Yeah,
just
yeah.
the example that you gave is that we are not just floating in and doing our thing. We are creating disturbances. And the one you mentioned is interesting as well. Getting in to do the work in some pristine or unpopulated area. There's a lot of disturbance just bringing in the equipment,
Mm-hmm.
doing that aspect as well. So you
Mm-hmm.
may decide to take a different approach on those areas because of the pristine surroundings than you would if you were in a very populated area, for example.
Mm-hmm. Do you think in that example, do you think there's going to be much use in like in drone seeding or something like that to try and minimize the actual impact on the ground? I'm not sure how. I know drone seeding in and of itself has been hit and miss, and it's not, you know what I mean. It's not as a
Mm-hmm.
holy grail as everyone seems to think it is, but it seems to have its opportunity and its chance to do something
Oh,
useful, right?
I totally agree,
Yeah.
and I think there again too, when you first start studying reclamation, you think, here's the textbook,
Mm-hmm.
and here's all the points. And then you realize, oh, but it has to be different for this environment. It has to be different. We have to take this into consideration here. So I think there's going to be a lot more of less invasive, less disturbing kinds of reclamation
Mm-hmm.
techniques that we're going to be using.
Mm.
And drones is a perfect example. Even when we're monitoring for reclamation is required. You don't get a reclamation certificate if you don't do the appropriate monitoring and come up with the appropriate data. But monitoring in itself can be very destructive and very disturbing. So if you're working in a very sensitive environment and you have people tromping around there trying to do vegetation assessments and taking soil samples, then you're actually continuing that disturbance,
Mm.
albeit on a bit of a small scale. So I can even see appropriate drone monitoring taking place and that gaining a lot of momentum.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, that makes sense. Yeah, it's fascinating. And my brain went to a really, really weird place of when you're talking about walking around and stuff like that and then you can go really crazy with it and say, well, people are technically part of nature and we're part of the, you know what I mean? And that's not really disturbance. It's just nature taking its place. If you wanted to go that route, right? Like you can
Oh,
get really philosophical.
absolutely. Yeah, and that's one of the discussions we often have in the land reclamation courses that I teach is, well, we are part of the environment. We can't talk about ourselves as being separate from nature. We are part of nature.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a fun one to get to go down that
Oh, it
route because
is.
then you start talking about, well, what really is our responsibility and what really, yeah, like it is really fascinating for sure.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
love it.
it certainly is.
I'm not sure how useful it is, but it's
Well,
interesting.
it's interesting, and I think it provides a useful focus as well.
Mhm.
Just to give you an example, soil reclamation has always been at the heart of land reclamation right from the very beginning.
Right.
And so we are reclaiming soils, we are rebuilding them, but we're
Hmm.
not making them.
Hmm.
And an interesting controversial aspect of land reclamation right now is making soil.
Oh.
And these are called anthroposols. I've done a
Mm.
lot of work on anthroposols, and we're actually considering including it in the revised Canadian system of soil classification. So some people do not believe we should be doing this. This is not our role. This is not natural. We don't go out and build soils. But when you think about a lot of particularly legacy disturbances that have been there for a long time, and there's probably not even a company around anymore that would assume or could assume responsibility for the reclamation. And in the earlier days of mining, soil salvage and stockpiling was not what we do today. I mean, it's a real science today. So some of those legacy disturbances, the biggest problem is there is no soil to do the reclamation.
Right.
But we've got a lot of material, a lot of waste material that we can use as amendments to actually build these soils. And I think it just ties in beautifully with an area that I'm quite interested in, which is reducing landfills, sizes, duration, etc. And so if we have a lot of this material that's being carted off to the landfill, organic material that we could be using in reclamation, it's kind of tackling two sustainability issues at the same time. Mm-hmm. So I'm very much a believer in making soil, and it's kind of it's not really making it in the true sense, because what you do is it's like making a cake. You put all the ingredients together, and
it's like you making a cake.
And then
anybody could do it. Yeah,
yeah. You layer it. You add the organic material. You do what you need to, and then you turn it over to nature, and the natural processes, the ecological processes that need to take place in that soil for it to be viable. That's what starts happening. And so when we look at some of these anthroposols 20 years later, we see that they are starting more to resemble natural soils than they are human-made soils.
So how do we go about getting the raw material for making anthroposols? I'm confused as to, you know what I mean? Like what like, are we talking about just the organic, or are we talking about also making the mineral soils and everything else?
It's the organic.
Okay.
Yeah, we have, we haven't quite got to the point where we can make mineral soil yet.
Yeah. I was like, whoa, what are you guys doing over there?
But a lot of things that happen with soil in the process of being stockpiled for years, for decades, soil that has undergone some remediation treatment that essentially renders it, a non-living entity, then adding the organic matter is so important. And it's the organic matter that's usually missing, because just the way the soil is stored and the time period over which the organic matter deteriorates, for example. So when we can pull these materials in, and we might be talking about, spent mushroom compost, for example, or some of the vegetative material that we might be using to produce products like ketchup, like a lot of the tomato material, wood waste from forestry, for example.
Oh, yeah.
So most of those materials, those organic materials, can be used in different combinations to mix with some of the unsuitable mineral soil that we have on that disturbance to actually build this soil.
Right. That's interesting, because that's one of the big wastes that forestry has right now is burn piles of stuff that is, it's not economical to bring it back to the mill to use it for fuel. It's not, it's just branches and busted up trees, and so they just burn it on site. And because there's too much of it, they leave a certain amount on the landscape to decompose and become organic matter. But some of it, a lot of it is burned up, and they're always trying to figure out how can we use this economically. And there's been all kinds of things about you put a dome over it and burn it and store the energy, and then there's all kinds of so that's something that you think that if you could get at it, you could turn it into something useful for maybe. You know what I mean? Forestry activities happening in the bush. So you could actually take it and put it to a nearby reclamation site and turn it into something useful.
Absolutely. And let me give you another really important example. So the forest floor material, the LFH material, for the longest time, we were just scraping it off when the disturbances were created. So let's talk oil sands, for example. And this material was just thrown in the hole or burned with the woody debris that was burned on site. So some research that I was involved with a graduate student for quite a few years, was actually using this LFH material for plant propagules for seed sources. And when you think about it, it's this beautiful living gold material in a sense, because it's harboring these plant species that I can't just go out and buy.
Yeah.
And so if I can salvage that material, so a lot of science went into what depth do you salvage, how long can you stockpile the material and still have seed viability, and then how much do you actually have to replace. So as you can guess, the shallower you salvage and the deeper you place, the better outcome you get from the perspective of number of plants and diversity of plants. But then, so that's what you would aim for. But then when you throw in, okay, economically, how can we make this work a little bit better? How can we stretch it out? Then you come up with, here's the cutoff point for how deep you should salvage. And here's the cutoff point for how thin you should actually spread. Now, when you take that LFH material and then you take the woody debris and you place those on the reclaimed site together, it's almost like a little bit of magic taking place, because now you have all these species that you can't go out and buy the seeds for that are germinating. The woody debris is doing a few things. It's preventing erosion or reducing erosion, because you don't just have this open, flat area of land. And the woody debris, as it breaks down, adds nutrients to the soil. It creates little microsites. So some seeds need to germinate in the dark, some need to germinate in the light. And so it creates these appropriate microsites for different species to germinate. And so what we've done is we've just taken waste material that normally would have been burned or would have been thrown into the pit, and we're using it as reclamation material, and it's really enhancing our reclamation success.
Right. So just that little bit of knowing before you go in of, hey, let's save this stuff makes a world of difference in the end of it. So it seems like the new disturbances, or relatively new disturbances, where reclamation specialists can be involved in before pre-disturbance, it seems like your success rate is pretty high.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
And that's the key. And I mentioned that earlier as well. Historically, land reclamation people came in, clean up the mess at the end. And
yeah, right. It's kind of cleanup crew. Yeah.
Yeah. And we would look at it and say, geez, too bad they didn't do this, or too bad they didn't do that. So now when you have part of the reclamation plan before you ever get the approval is, okay, you have to stockpile the soil this way. You have to separate the soil horizons. This is LFH material. This is only going to be viable from a plant propagule perspective for maybe a year. The work that we've done would show that within a year, most of the viability of the stockpiled material is pretty much gone. There's a few species that are still viable, but most are not. And so what we want to see then is for the company to say, well, we're not going to reclaim this area for a decade, but that material is not going to be viable for a decade. So where else can you put it? Do you have another area, another piece of land that's ready to be reclaimed that you might be able to use it? And speculatively, we were talking about this great interaction that we might have with companies someday in the future, where company A would say, "I've got all of this LFH and woody debris that I can't use right now, but you guys are doing some reclamation, so let's make a deal.
Yeah.
You take our LFH, we want some of yours when we're going to be reclaiming, just so that we don't use or don't lose the opportunity to get the best out of those materials."
Right. So you need a network. You need a network that's open and kind of a library of, this person has what we need, and we'll just connect and problem solve, and vice versa. And so does that exist?
Not so much. I know there's been some discussion around it, but companies tend to want to keep their own materials. And of course, there's always the cost of transportation, et cetera. So there seem to be a lot of barriers that we still have to work towards trying to eradicate.
Well, there's your next project. As if you
Yeah.
don't already have 40 going at the same time already.
There's always a next project, always a next one.
So this brings up a good point or a good question about the responsibility of industries for reclamation. And when it is a public resource and they are like, sure, they're paying, not taxes, what's the word? Royalties
Yeah.
to the government for the rights but there's it's not just pay the royalty and you've done your due diligence. What is their responsibility and who holds them to task on that responsibility of making sure that the land is not just left, like so many orphaned wells have been left in our province?
Yeah. So they have a responsibility to reclaim. Mm-hmm. And to what level they need to reclaim will be built into their approval. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that approval wording might be as simple as reclaim to the standards of the day. Sometimes it's very specific that it needs to be a specific type of forest or a specific type of land use. So they are held accountable to that by virtue of accepting that approval and operating.
Or else what?
Pardon?
Or else what?
Or else, well, that's what I was going to get to. So they don't get a reclamation certificate and they are responsible until they get that reclamation certificate. So what happens if they don't reclaim? Well, that's an interesting question, because if a company decided it didn't want to reclaim because it was going to be too expensive, they simply keep that land operational. And we have a lot of well sites right now, for example, that are non-producing well sites, but they're not being reclaimed. And the companies are still in existence. They still own that. And so it's almost cheaper for them to be paying the lease to the landowner, often these are farmers, than to go in and do the remediation and the reclamation that's required. So there's not as much of a push. Like what I would like to see is a time period within which reclamation needs to take place. So if you're done with production, you're done mining, you're done pumping the gas or the oil, then that's the time that you reclaim, rather than you have this great big period of time where you're not held accountable.
That seems very, very, it's just very discouraging and just shake your head, like unethical. Like how do you as a person, if you know that that's going on, how do you, not you, but like if you're a part of the company that's deciding like, oh, well, we can just screw over the public and not do it, and then we'll go out of business and don't worry about it.
Yeah.
And it's just like, this is, this is,
and I do have to, make the point that there are many good companies,
of course,
and they take their responsibility seriously, and they will do the best that they can. I've had the opportunity to work with some of these companies, and sometimes I can't believe what amount of money and what they are willing to do to get that land back the way it should. So these are usually the really tough projects that I get called in to work with them. But there are a lot, just as you said, that we'll get what we can here and not worry about it. We'll just close our company, go bankrupt, or
there's
whatever.
There's always bad players, right?
Yeah,
in every industry.
Yeah.
It's not specific to these industries. It's just there's always shitty people out there.
Yeah. And even if we did have a specified time frame in which reclamation had to take place, that may not stop these companies, because they would know that this is the period of time we have before we can walk away. And there's other ways of regulating it as well, that companies are only allowed a certain amount of disturbance at a given point in time. So they can't just keep developing new wells or new mine areas if they haven't done reclamation in others. So we've come a long way from the regulatory in that whole regulatory area, but we've still got a lot of loose ends to tie up and some very philosophical and practically hard decisions to make. Because it's always, even if you read our Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act, it's all about balancing the environment and economy. Well, what does balancing it mean?
Yeah, very vague.
Yeah, so you need to take into consideration that we have to have these disturbances if we are to continue the world in which we exist and which many of us seem to like to live in.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you can't keep pushing the responsibility for environmental dealing with the environment for doing the reclamation.
Yeah.
You have to really view that as a true balance. And when you think about a balance, there's always a score sheet. So maybe we look at areas disturbed. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
we look at area disturbed relative to successful reclamation. So the regulators have a little bit of work to do there.
Yeah, it seems like balance shouldn't be a subjective term, right? I
No,
mean,
no.
it so often is, but it seems like it shouldn't be subjective. It should be something that no, we can add up all these numbers, and this is what we're responsible for. And yeah, I find it incredibly frustrating and irksome that there are loopholes in which companies can get around this and just walk away without any responsibility by going bankrupt and changing their name.
Yeah, and the companies that are doing well, it bothers them too because it
Yes.
gives a black mark on the industry, right?
Most of the big companies are very, very responsible, and they're doing their due diligence to do all that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so I think some of the companies working together, more not just enforcement from the regulatory bodies, but maybe some subtle or not so subtle pressure from
Mm-hmm.
your peers in that industry as well would be very helpful.
Start speaking up.
Yeah.
Don't keep quiet when someone's doing something that you don't like. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to do. It takes a lot of courage to be able to stand out and be seen as the bleeding heart or whatever, right? But it's becoming necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole concept of social license, I think, helps a
Sure.
little bit there too,
Mm-hmm.
because if we as consumers make smart choices and we decide we're going to make our choices for whatever we need, fuel, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
then we have a lot of control too.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we're saying we're not buying your product because you don't clean up your environmental messes, then that product becomes less valuable for that
Yeah.
particular company. So
Oh yeah.
I think we always look to the regulators first, and
Mm-hmm.
then we look to the industry almost to police itself. But sometimes we forget that we, the consumers, carry a lot of weight. And if
Absolutely.
we would only act on that, and then you get to the consumer level, of course, it's hard when, you're raising a family, you don't have a great paycheck, and, you're just trying to meet and make ends meet.
Mm-hmm.
You're not necessarily going to make sustainable environmental choices. You're going to take the cheapest fuel or whatever you have to spend the less money for.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. No, there's the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like you gotta
Yeah.
be able to
Yeah.
feed yourself before you can worry about everything else, all the more privileged ideas of how to save the world or whatever, right? It's not
Right.
you don't
Right.
get to think about how saving the world unless you've got a full belly. So it's for sure.
So well put.
Yeah. It's these issues are really interesting, and I am very like I have noticed that as well. Like you said, that a lot of these companies, these extraction companies, are very responsible, and they're going above and beyond to see themselves as not just an energy company, but responsible for
Mm-hmm.
the locality and their emissions and everything like that. And that's awesome. And I love that's the way our society's going, and that we have that those environmental, social responsibility metrics and those publicly traded companies, and even just I think the people are starting to recognize. The people involved, like the higher ups in some of these companies, they've realized that they have an impact, and they want to be part of the solution as well, right? Like we're going to be using hydrocarbon energy for many, many, many years. Like we can't just shut the tap off, right? And
That's right.
so,
It's here for a while, and you're right. I'm really seeing a lot of changes in more companies.
yeah, absolutely, yeah, and it's exciting to see. So, yeah, it's. What about I wanted to talk a little bit about the actual measuring success of reclamation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like maybe the certification. You mentioned the certification a bunch of times. Where does the certification come from? How do we I guess how do we know that once something's been certified that it's sufficient? How much like audit is being done? How much keeping track of that through time? Is it just an establishment thing and then you walk away, or do you have to keep track of it over decades? And, I just want to know, how do we know that what's being done is good?
Yes. So that last question is the most difficult one to answer. So I'll start with a few of the others.
Sure.
So the whole certification process is government built. So the regulatory bodies are the ones that determine what the success metrics are going to be. Mm-hmm. And in some jurisdictions, of course, those are much more stringent, much more detailed than others. Alberta has always been leading the way in regulatory requirements. So, when I go back to kind of the big focus in Alberta in the 60s, for example, and the stuff that I'm reading that was done by groups of people and the government to say, we will do more than just fill in the hole. Mm-hmm. And so the regulatory bodies have worked to match the times, I would say, because initially you didn't have to do anything. You right. Go dig let's take mines as an example. You go dig your mine site, you do your thing.
Similar to forestry, right? And originally you just cut and walked away, right? It was the same thing. It was just the times. You weren't aware.
Yeah. And then it became, well, you have to fill the holes at least, and probably fill them in a way that's going to be safe, so humans and animals aren't going to break a leg or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then it evolved very quickly. The whole 60s, 70s, 80s in Alberta was just amazing to see the regulatory development. And so then it became, well, you have to have a certain % cover of vegetation. Your soil has to be equivalent to what was there before, and you'd be measuring chemical properties, physical properties, etc. So then it became very much focused on, if you meet these requirements and a certain period of time has gone by and you've done the appropriate monitoring for these metrics, then you get your reclamation certificate. So at one point in time, we had a lot of government inspectors that went out, and before you got a rec cert, then you would have this site evaluated by a reclamation inspector. Mm-hmm. So with cutbacks and changes in the government system, we don't have as many of those environmental inspectors, but it's almost on an honor system with the company, but it's also random checks that might be done on a particular site. We got the Environmental Appeals Board that deals with, reclamation that's not done appropriately. So there's still a lot of monitoring that has to be done, metrics that have to be met before you get that reclamation certificate. And it varies with disturbance. So for example, the one that's probably the most stringent is the well site criteria. And those have to be followed before you get the reclamation certificate. So it's another part of the science and the practice that's in flux. It's not where it needs to be, but it is in a relatively good place compared to other jurisdictions, other countries in particular. And this whole area, Matt, has really opened up as well. We have a lot of people studying, are we measuring the right things?
Yeah.
Like if we go and we just measure soil chemical and physical properties, what about the soil biological properties? We all know the importance of soil microorganisms and that microbial community, and the necessity of that community in just keeping that soil a living, breathing thing.
Especially when you talk about something like mycorrhizal communities and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then, I have a graduate student right now, for example, that we're saying, what about the entomological population, the vertebrate population? We know how critical they are, again, for an ecosystem to be functioning. Shouldn't we be determining if the right beetles are coming in, or, all of these other invertebrates that need to be part of that system?
Yeah.
So we're starting to broaden the approach to reclamation success. Now, it'll be real interesting when we complete some of the studies that we're involved in right now to say, if we have the appropriate metrics met from the soils perspective, and if we have the appropriate plant community perspective, does that mean the rest of it's just there naturally anyway? So we
Right.
don't really have to worry about these microorganisms, or we don't have to worry about the invertebrates, and we don't have to worry about the habitat, because if the plants in the soil are okay and the hydrologic regime is what it should be, then the rest should be there as
Right.
part of a natural ecosystem.
You can't
So it'll
look at
be really
everything. Yeah.
interesting to see. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a common question, or the common problem, right? We can't measure every single thing. So we got to pick
Exactly.
something that's all encompassing and go with that, because otherwise the cost becomes astronomical and then never gets done. So yeah.
Exactly.
For sure.
Yeah. So I don't think we're going to be changing the monitoring metrics a whole lot. I mean, just based on what I'm seeing, I think we're kind of close to where we need to be. And maybe in particular scenarios, again, with more of an ecological restoration perspective, we may be focusing more on the faunal populations than we have been. And so we have to be careful too that we don't say, well, what we need to do for an agricultural field is the same as what we have to do for this natural area. I think we have to say, this is different. Here's what's needed in addition to the basic metrics that we need to collect.
Yeah, but it's definitely getting more. There's more people thinking about it, and it's developing as time goes on. So that's good.
Oh,
that's
absolutely.
Good. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
That was my main question, right? Was whether or not it was the Wild West, or there's actually regulatory in place, and that's good to hear. So there was something you mentioned before. I want to briefly. We hear so much talk about, especially in Alberta right now, about the problem with orphan wells and what to do with them, and what can you, like, we don't have to go crazy deep into it. I'm sure you could talk on it for hours, but what is this situation? What are these orphan wells? Where did they come from? Who's responsible? What can be done?
Yeah, this could be a long conversation. So in a nutshell, usually we end up with an orphan well because a company has gone bankrupt or ceased business for whatever reason. And so that well literally becomes an orphan, and nobody's there to assume the responsibility for looking after it. So we have the orphan well association that's been trying to at least reclaim some of these wells every year. And that's basically with money that was put in as kind of a deposit from the companies who are developing the wells. Okay. So I think it's a good association. I think there's a lot of opportunity to deal with some of the well sites, but we've got so many that we're never going to catch up, shall we say, if we keep doing things the way we are doing them, because there's just not enough money to reclaim these sites. So I had an idea a while back that wouldn't it be great if every company who's operating in the energy industry had the responsibility to reclaim one well site pro bono every year?
Oh, there you go.
And what they could do is they could take land reclamation students who would do a bit of an apprentice or an internship with the companies. So they would be learning how to do the work on the ground. It would be a practical aspect to their university degree program or their college program. And the companies would be doing this benefit for society, just like the lawyers, they take on a pro bono case or whatever. So it's something that I've floated out there a few times and will continue to do so, because I am concerned about many of these sites that are just sitting there, and which ones do you target first? Because if you have so much money that you can use a year and you've got one really badly contaminated well site, that might be the only one that you get done that year. So do you do a whole bunch of the easy to reclaim ones, or do you focus on the bigger problems, the more expensive ones?
That's
so it's I like the fact that we're not just sitting back and letting this evolve, but we are actively involved in it. But maybe we can shake it up a little bit and get a few more of those areas reclaimed.
No, yeah, it is interesting for sure. What about, there's been a few ideas floating around about converting because they're already hooked up to the grid, these orphan wells, they technically have electricity and everything else or whatever, right? But hooking them up with like solar panels or something like that, because it's already an existing disturbance.
Yeah.
And how viable is that? Does that make sense? It seems like, you know what I mean? It's just one of those questions I don't have enough information to answer whether or not it's actually viable or not.
Well, that's the big question right now, Matt, is whether it is viable. It sounds like a really interesting approach. And so the other thing that's being bandied about is using them for geothermal energy development, because we already have in some of these areas, we have good geothermal sources of energy. So why wouldn't we, instead of reclaiming those sites and digging another hole for geothermal, just use them? So I think these are good ideas, because we are going to disturb anyway. The big question becomes when that geothermal well is exhausted and when that solar panel array is no longer needed in that particular area, who's responsible?
Right.
And so if we were doing this on orphan well sites, if those orphan well sites happen to be in the areas where these new ideas could be implemented, that's great. It's a good use of that already disturbed space. But unfortunately, a lot of these orphan wells are not in areas where geothermal would be viable, or even solar would be viable. But once we start, and we're getting there too, really, with the grids and storage research that's going on, where we have much better storage systems, smaller, less cumbersome battery systems, there might be a bit more viability in the solar aspect as well. But I am a firm believer in if we have a disturbance and we're going to be making another one for some reasonable purpose in that immediate vicinity, then don't do it. Use that existing disturbance.
Right. It just makes sense. Yeah, it's there.
It just does. It really does.
Yeah, for sure. No, absolutely. Cool. Yeah, and that's all I kind of really wanted, was just a brief overview of kind of what's, and so it seems like we're still trying to sort out exactly what to do and how to do it, but good. Thank you. I appreciate it. So, just kind of a final couple questions just for fun.
Sure.
Is, one a little more doomsday, and then the last one kind of happy-go-lucky. What worries you about your area expertise, about what's going on, whether it's global or provincial or national? And then finally, what excites you? What are you looking forward to?
And I'll answer them in that order. What worries me is that we're just taking so long to do some of the things that we should be doing and implementing some of the new technologies. And it just, this whole COVID scenario just really reminded me of what we can do when we put our hearts and minds into it and we work together.
No kidding.
And so if we could take that approach to the environment and the legacy disturbances we have, and the opportunity to actually pilot and test on a field scale some of the lab scale technologies that are being developed right now. So what worries me is that we're just taking too much time. But what excites me is the fact that we have all these technologies and we have all these ideas, and we have a lot of people that are really excited and interested in being part of trying to implement them and move this forward, and people who are making appropriate choices that will help some of these companies to realize, you mess around with the environment, nobody's going to buy your stuff. So get on board and do what you need to be doing. So I'm really excited about people around the planet that are starting to think more from a sustainable perspective and really thinking more about the environment as something that's critical and vital and necessary for our life on this planet. That's exciting.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more, for sure. I think it's so easy to have a fatalistic perspective on the environment when there's so much just negative press about all the negative impact we're having. And it's true. But there's also the good stories, the success stories don't get that attention. And so I think it's it's unfortunate that, but it's also good, I guess, in a way that people, when they get that fatalistic perspective, it also kind of motivates them to get involved and to do something about it. So it's a double-edged sword again. But I agree. It's awesome to see the huge movement of
yes,
people being involved, and just everyday people, not necessarily people in the environmental community for career-wise, but just people thinking about their emissions and, their sustainability and how they get to work and where their garbage goes, and just people, our entire society, global society, seems to be starting to think that way. So it's really exciting for me. And I think I can only think about how I think the progress is good, right? I think we're heading in the right direction.
I think the progress is good, and we are heading in the right direction. And what's also exciting is that we have the young people in our populations that are looking at environmental careers, and if they're not, they're looking at sustainability as a way of life for them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, I love it.
So it's fine for me and my generation to know this and to feel this and to believe it, but we have to make sure that, and we are, that the younger generation who will be taking over very soon, long before we're done with hydrocarbons, are actually thinking along these sustainability lines, and the environment is important to them, even if they're living in the city. So this is good. That it's really good.
I agree. No, I'm very excited about the future and where it leads, and it's going to be excited to watch and to see what's going on. So thanks so much for taking the time to do this, Anne. This was really, really good. I feel like we could have talked for a very long time. There's more discussions to be had here for sure.
Absolutely. And it's been a pleasure talking with you, Matt. Thank you for putting this important topic on your radar.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Absolutely. I really enjoyed it. It's been a long time. It's been a long time coming.
Yes, it has. But it's good we've had the conversation, and perhaps we'll have another one on another topic down the road.
I would like to propose that. Yes.
Indeed.
Awesome. Thank you so much for listening. I really, really enjoyed that conversation. I hope you liked it as much as I did. Please, if you really enjoyed this, share it on social media. Tell your friends. It's free content, and the more that you guys get it out there, the more it helps me. I really, really would appreciate it. Just the small act of telling somebody about it, or, sharing it on social media. You can follow me. I am all of your Forest podcasts. So anything you see online is me. I'm not very good at the social media stuff, but I do what I can. And all my episodes are posted there. So if you want updates, that's where you can find it, on Your Forest Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all that stuff. And we'll see you guys in a few weeks with some more cool conversations about the environment and the people that live and work for it. So take care. See you later.